It is the Big Signorelli, aka the Big Sig of the Vanishing Mediators channel, one third of the Vanishing Mediators. What you're seeing right now is a series of individual set recordings given by myself, Maximilian Costa, and Nick Castellucci. The reason for this is because we deemed it necessary that some of these seminar lectures don't really deserve much attention in a group discussion and can be fleshed out solo. So we've taken the liberty to do a recording slash lecture exegetical on our own to give to you all. And we want to make sure that we do this with the intention of providing you with the tools and the knowledge of the entire seminar without leaving everything out. And so with that being said, I will be giving a lecture slash exegetical read along on one of the seminar lectures given in seminar 3, of course, if you've been keeping up. It is called An Address, Freud of the Century. Before I go on to discuss this lecture seminar, I want to recap for any of you seeing this um, lecture episode that haven't been really engaged with the entire seminar series, or maybe even our prior seminar series, such as seminars 1 and 2. So with seminar 3, the psychoses, Lacan is fleshing out the, let's say, um, presuppositions of psychoses hitherto his time. And this is coming from uh, various notions in psychiatry, such as the organic and biological cause, or to be more accurate, a sort of ontogenetic cause of psychotic disturbances, such as verbal hallucinations, delusions, you name it. And while Lacan was a psychiatrist prior to psychoanalytic engagement work with Freud and various other schools, he delved in the psychiatric field and specifically with the works of Karl Jasper. You could find the sort of history of uh, Lacan psychiatric studies in a small compendium called Seminars 1 and 2. Reading Seminars 1 and 2 by Jacques Miller. Jacques Miller gives a really cool historical account on Lacan's early career prior to, his essays on the mirror stage, his other essays on like criminology and function and field prior to even Seminar 1. But the reason why I bring this up is because Lacan is not only knowledgeable in the Freudian field, but he also has a background in psychiatry. So he's able to tackle the problem and the investigation of psychosis from multiple angles. Now, what Lacan does in the seminar is grapple with a few people in the psychiatry field. Henri, who was a colleague of his, and then another a figure named Claren Bolt. But in the beginning, he wants to highlight one of the major discrepancies, not only in psychiatry with this biological or organic causation or some psychical causation innate within the subject that triggers psychosis, but even the fact that this is a sort of deviation from understanding and meaningful, let's say, consciousness, which we get from someone like Karl Jasper, who was not only a psychiatrist, but also someone in the field of existentialism and humanism. And so what Lacan is doing right here is kind of showing that there's nothing to understand in the field of delusion. Yes, we could say that for him, all these delusions or verbal hallucinations are full of meaning, but there's no specific meaning to extract from because it's only full of meaning for the psychotic patient who believes that these hallucinations or delusions are a divine revelation from God or some type of extraterrestrial being or whatever the case may be, that brings about a sort of paranoia that the other wants something from them and they're certain about it, or that they are, some type of scribe from a divine oracle that is, sequestering this knowledge that only a few could gain access to. But then we get into understanding, from Lacan's standpoint, the Freudian discovery, of not only psychoanalysis and neurosis, but also what the unconscious is and the psychotic's relationship to the unconscious. And for Lacan, the unconscious is structured like a language. I'll repeat that. The unconscious is structured like a language. It is not language. He is not reducing everything to language, but to understand Freud's inquiry, we see that for psychoanalysis, especially in the clinical aspect and technique that involves the patient lying on the couch, going through free association, that these symptoms manifest through speech. And so we get this sort of dialectic between speech and language insofar as the unconscious is structured like a language and manifests when it ruptures language in speech. Examples are the parapraxoses, like the slips of the tongue, the witticisms and jokes, the slip of the pen, the forgetting of names, what Lacan will call full speech versus empty speech. Empty speech is just idle chatter or anything that has no clinical efficacy or leads to a moment in the treatment, which is a product of the transference, for a lack of a better term. So later on, we finally get, for the first time in this seminar, Lacan's use of Saussure and the inversion of the Saussurian signifier signified relationship to not focus on an already given signified closed system, but one of the signified. What he says is, and you could go and watch our lecture on chapters 10 and 11, where we get into the details of what the signifier is for Lacan. And so, to put a long story short, the signifier is nothing at all. It doesn't do anything at all. It is just, in a sense, pure writing. The signifier doesn't do anything but signify an absence. When we look at traditional Saussurian linguistics, the signifier shares a relationship to the signified. The signifier is an audio image, right? It is a representative or representation, we could say, maybe, but we could say that we have the word cat. And not only do we have the image cat, but it also corresponds to something like cat. Um, and then we get into the whole intricacies of what's called synchrony and diachrony. Synchrony is the way that this signifier can be used in various ways, and the diachrony is in the way in which it transforms over time, has a history, and carries on, and even transforms in a discourse through this time and history. But the main point to understand what distinguishes the signifier for Lacan versus the signifier from Saussure is that there is no referent. The word cat has a referent to a specific four-legged feline. Or even like in slang, if you know, like, more like slang uses of the word cat, cat could refer to a person, like, hey, that cat over there, he's up to no good. Um, these are ways in which language can play around over time, or certain signifiers take on different meanings. But nevertheless, for that example, there is still a referent. And then we could see, in a sense, that natural signs take on a form as well. With, for example, if we see smoke in the air, that's usually a referent for a fire, right? Um, Certain animals give off natural signs that refer to, um, mating season. Then we have for Lacan the trace, in which we have something that's there, but the referent is absent, but it still has a referent. So what that means, for example, and again, I'm drawing from the examples that Max gave us in the uh, chapters 10 and 11 video. Um, we have ash, right? And that's indicative of a fire. The ash traces to a fire that was once there, or footsteps in the woods, or maybe like footsteps on the beach, sand, right? Indicative of someone who was walking there, right? So even though the referent isn't fully present, the trace could lead us to the specific referent. But the signifier itself for Lacan, which is also a symptom of the unconscious, has no referent, has no natural sign. It signifies nothing at all. And so this absence of a referent needs another signifier to represent for the absence. And we can see how this builds up into later Lacan, not as in the later seminars, like past seminar 11 and above, which we would consider late Lacan in this, stereotypical chronology of his works. But later on, after the seminar, we get this dictum: the signifier represents the subject for another signifier. The subject of the unconscious has no referent. So what we have is a signifier that represents the subject. Subject has a representative, and it relates it for another signifier for its meaning, right? Meaning for the Saussurian signifier, signified relationship is on the level of the signified, but there is no signified for this signifier of the unconscious. So we have other signifiers that represent that absence of meaning. So that was a little tangent on there, but that just shows what we're dealing with and how that relates to neurosis. Obsessional and the hysteric both are structured like a question. The obsessional wonders if they're alive or they're dead. This oscillation between being and non-being, the typical Hamlet, to be or not to be, this existential question, not on a level of consciousness or of one's facticity in a Heideggerian or Sartrean way, but more along the lines of what the subject is split from himself and not himself. And what Lacan says is that this is because this signifier is just purely writing, it can't explain any existential fact of his life or of his death, right? And the obsessional is fixated on an idea of oscillating between presence and absence because of the signifier. The hysteric is mainly focused on her relationship in the symbolic order, and this is because of a certain privation or a gap within the symbolic order. She structures around whether or not she is capable of doing such thing in society, or the typical one, am I a man or am I a woman, right? So this is covered in the middle of the seminar, and then we're now towards the final section of the seminar after we understood not only the function of the signifier, but also its relationship to metaphor and antinomy. Please check out that episode that we recorded. You'll get a better understanding from that than me explaining it on here. I'm just kind of giving you the sort of foreground. And I think really, rather than going on a little synopsis of metaphor and metonymy, it was a lot more appropriate to go over the signifier, for better or for worse, because the signifier is definitely the key thing to understanding Lacan's um, structure and why he prefers structure over these clinical diagnoses that rely on this insistence of understanding or some type of psychical association or psychical cause, a mental causation, or something that has a sort of organic biological cause, right? That, most psychiatry falls prey to this sort of biotheology, for a lack of a better term, um, or the sort of like juridical astrology of being able to like pinpoint something, so therefore everybody else is like this. Okay, so the address, Freud in the Century, right? What we're dealing with is pretty much a sort of foreground of Freud's entire career, up until Lacan comes on the scene to tell us why we must return to Freud, right? And it opens up with a colleague of his named Jean Delay, who pretty much describes a theoretical birth. Freud, not the person, but Freud, the psychoanalyst, Freud, the scientific uh, genius, Freud, the man who created a new discipline that changed not only the way that we look at science and maybe ontology, maybe in philosophy, but the way that psychoanalysis, this, you know, so bizarre, obscure, and hard to pinpoint discourse changes the way that we view all human sciences. And that is because of one thing: the birth of the unconscious. Okay. So Lacan then jumps in to uh, give his piece, right? Um, as he says, it's not a praise, right? Um, or is he like trying to give a biographical account? He says that, he's not giving his procedure of laying out Freud's entire scientific discovery and his theoretical career is not panegyrical, right? He's not giving him specific praise, but what he wants to show is really the key theoretical outline of Freud, what exactly psychoanalysis was for him, and dispelling a lot of the myths or these sort of preconceived insistence to pinpoint what psychoanalysis is by a sort of biographical account or cultural outline of the man's position. And you could see this a lot in even today. Why did Freud really think about women the way he did? Was it because of his privilege and him being a white Jewish man who lived in Victorian society and being around a bunch of white scientific males, stuff like this? Even in Seminar 2, the critique of Erickson's analysis of Freud's interpretation of dreams and the Irma's injection is one that, if I'm not mistaken, was based on a sort of social analysis, the critique of Freud's social values and cultural upbringing. And this is further from the truth, right? You what Lacan is getting at is that what we get is a discovery of a new theoretical discipline that can only be born based off of a certain criteria that Freud was following by being a scientist, not by being a white male, not by being Jewish, not by living a certain time in society, right? Not by tracing his childhood and seeing how the role models that he had, the fact that he lived with mostly women and his mother, or the relationship that he had with his father, or his marriage, or his relationship with his daughter. None of these things matter for Lacan in the sense that uh, we are talking about the birth of psychoanalysis. And he gives us this really great lesson in a quote that I'll read right here, pretty much saying that, you know, there's nothing biographical that we can't already find in Freud's own autobiography. And he's being very kind of specific about using this term autobiography. Not that Freud wrote a legit autobiography of himself. No, we have autobiographical accounts in his own writing that are kernels, that are gems of theoretical value for psychoanalysis. And he lists them right here. We have the psychopathology of everyday life. We have the Traum de Tun, the interpretation of dreams in English, and Der Witz, the jokes and the relationships to the unconscious. These works contain self-analysis of Freud because there was no psychoanalyst prior to Freud. Freud was the psychoanalyst. And this is what makes this discovery so very, hard to dissect, and it's hard to separate the man from the discipline. But we could say maybe it can be done, but the point is that there would be no psychoanalysis without Freud. But when we're talking about the man Freud, we're not talking about somebody who was born in Austria. I don't, if maybe the sort of geographical and biographical accounts may be incorrect on my part, but the point being is that we don't need to look at his personal life, what the man enjoyed, the fact that he did cocaine or something like that, or the fact that he, had an interesting relationship with his mother, or like, the relationship with his father, even being a father himself, or like the type of person he was. We don't need to go there. And so what Lacan says is someone's works should be judged by the standard of its own criteria, meaning that we need to judge Freud's work by the criteria of psychoanalysis, not by cultural accounts of the man's life, nor biographical accounts of his childhood, his early, years in his academia and medical school, etc. No, it's all in the works that he written. And it's interesting how we don't treat really any other thinker, like that. And in the Anglo world, it seems to be a big thing to want to pick apart Freud and his theories because they're very hard to take in as a whole, because there's a sort of puritanical nature to the Anglophone world when it comes to theory, philosophy, and science. And it's not just the fact that, the theory of the unconscious seems like at first glance a pseudoscientific thing. We could probably even prove that in various ways, but nobody wants to give Freud credit because of this insistence to do the thing that we're critiquing as a good Lacanian Freudian, but also the fact that the, inquiry of sexuality, and as Laplanche would say, it's Freud's discovery was infantile sexuality. This is even talked about in Alenka Supančič's What is Sex, that we could talk about sex and everyday, but when it comes to the fact that Freud's discovery of infantile sexuality was a theoretical discovery, that is where we draw the line and say no, right? There is this sort of puritanical nature to that, and this sort of huge frustration and aggressiveness to dismiss Freud and want to jab at him with a bunch of ad hominems. And I would say, to correct myself, the only other thinker, and again, Anglophone world, is Marx. And in Marx, we do the same thing, right? And it's also funny how there is a field called Freudo-Marxism, in which both Marx and Freud are married together because they have complementary theories. But I digress. The point being, we are going to judge the work based on the criteria of this. And again, we find it in interpretation of dreams, right? When Freud is trying to understand the nature of dreams, and he's investigating from antiquity, the use of dream interpretation for divinatory knowledge. We even get a small account of Aristotle, who talks about dreams. Many poets, even certain scientists that are very interested in the field of dreams. And of course, one of Freud's pupils, Carl Jung, is going to establish his entire analytic psychology around dreams, and that the unconscious has creativity, it has depth, it's vital, it's living. Freud's theory of dreams has nothing to do with that, right? For the analytic inquiry, the dreams for him represent, you know, many things, but ultimately what we're getting at is that the dream is a formation of the unconscious, which revolves around wish fulfillment or the fulfillment of the wish, right? It's that aim at the pleasure principle in the form of the dream when the dream reenacts a wish fulfillment. But not only is it trying to fulfill a wish, but it also produces the wish itself simultaneously. So there's a close proximity between a wish and the fulfillment of the wish. There's a sort of, like, you could say, uh, parallax or something like that. But that is the key thing for Freud. And so we sleep so that we can continue to dream. And it isn't about the dream itself as it happens, it's about how the dream is recounted for psychoanalysis, the way that it's brought into speech, and how the dream is divided by the manifest content and the latent content. We're not so much worried about how it manifests per se, or that we could even remember it, because there are certain dreams on the level of the preconscious. Let me rewind. We have the conscious, preconscious, and unconscious, right? It's more about the unconscious manifestation of it that matters for Freud, because this is where we get along the lines of censorship and repression. Again, watch our other stuff. I'm going to assume an audience, even though I said in the beginning that if you aren't keeping up with our stuff, this is the first time you've seen this video. Bear with me. Please go back and watch our stuff. Follow along if you're really a dedicated student to psychoanalysis. This is what it's for. This is not for content creation. This is not for you to subscribe and consume for your own enjoyment, even though learning should be enjoyable. This is to get yourself out of your comfort zone and to learn something. So bear in mind that I'm going to assume an audience at times, and for the time restriction, I'm not going to break down a lot of stuff. But for this portion, you have the conscious, right? You have the preconscious, and then you have the unconscious. This is the original model of the psyche for Freud. And during the time of interpretation of dreams, this is the model that he's working with. And so we do remember a lot of stuff on the on the preconscious and conscious level. The ego, the function of the ego allows ourselves to sort of relate and identify with these aspects. But there are stuff on the level of the unconscious that manifests that are censored, and that's due to a lot of things. Repression, the repression of this formation of the wish fulfillment, right? But again, this is only one work that Lacan is getting at. We have the we not only have the interpretation of dreams again, but we also have psychopathology everyday life. And what psychopathology of everyday life we could just sum up is just a huge text of a bunch of examples of parapraxis, whether it's forgetting of names, the slips of the tongue, the pen, and the same thing with dervits, or jokes in the relationship to the unconscious. It's the same thing. They're very much exhaustive texts on examples of different jokes and witticisms in how we could see the unconscious manifest and rupture speech, and rupture mainly conscious meaning, right? And so an example of what we get in the psychopathology of everyday life is the most famous one, which is Freud is with his colleague, and they are looking at a painting by the infamous Signorelli, a famous painting called Orvieto, which represents the Last Judgment, where God comes out to the sky and saves the world, while the devil is right there going to destroy all humanity. I think it's supposed to be the whole Revelations piece. And Freud forgets Signorelli's name and can't for the life of him figure out the name of the artist. So he starts free associating and goes through different names, Botticelli, Botticelli, and all these different names. And then he finally, through the internal letter and phonemic sounds, and the morphemic aspects, finally remembers, and really what is being repressed are these central ideas of life and death and how they relate to Freud, because Freud had a patient who was very promiscuous, a very hypersexual, and became impotent. It was a very much an obsession neurotic, and he made this very disturbing statement to Freud saying that a life without sex would be a life not worth living. He couldn't imagine a life without being sexually vital. And so he ended up committing suicide. And I think that had a huge blow on Freud, especially with this embryonic science and wanting to know what its role and place would be in the development of modern science, especially when he is still trying to understand what it is that he discovered. And also with still feeling a little self-conscious about his discovery of infantile sexuality and trying to discuss that with his prestigious colleagues. So these things right here are an example of how the autobiographical account of Freud is also a theoretical account of psychoanalysis, because, as I said, there was no psychoanalyst prior to Freud. Freud was the psychoanalyst. So a lot of the stuff that we get in these early texts are sort of self-analysis that Freud gives us. But it's not to say that, that's all that Freud did was just analyze himself. He had patients, many patients, successful ones and failed ones. And, Freud was humble enough to be able to publish his most failed cases, Dora, Wolfman, and Ratman. And surprisingly, the Schreber case that we're working on with the seminar, he did not see Schreber himself. He only analyzed them based upon the memoirs, right? So this kind of lays out what Lacan is really doing in this address. It's really to show the crucial elements of Freud's discovery of psychoneurosis, or as you'll divide it in hysteria and obsessional neurosis, and mainly the discovery of the unconscious that's structured like a language. And for an example, that psychopathology of everyday life one is how we could see the unconscious is structured like a language, in the way that this association was able to reveal itself through the free associative act, right? So now that we did that, I want to read, maybe a couple passages from here. I don't want to really get too lost into this section, because really we could just go ad nauseum to say why Freud had a intricate theory, and we need to not emphasize the biographical aspect of Freud to get at an understanding of, well, what psychoanalysis was. But let's read this right here. There is something here worth dwelling on, which is well suited to make us feel the value of a critical method. I shall surprise you with by saying that someone's work is to be judged by the standard criteria. I already said that before. So let's continue on. If the discovery of psychoanalysis really is to have a reintegrated into science an entire objectifiable field of man, and to have shown its supremacy, and if this field is the field of sense, why seek the genesis of the discovery outside the means of that its inventor encountered within himself along the path leading him to it? Why look elsewhere than in the register to which this discovery must, if one is to be rigorous, be limited? So pretty much he's saying what I kind of already elaborated ad nauseum. If we must have recourse to some other source foreign to the field discovered by the author and by nobody else to explain what it is, the prevalence of this field becomes null and void through having been made subordinate. To suppose the supremacy and not the subordination of sense as efficient cause is apparent to repudiate the principles of modern science. In fact, for the positive science to which Freud's masters, this pleiad that Jones quite rightly mentions at the beginning of his study, belong, the entire dynamics of sense can question beggingly be neglected. It is all fundamentally superstructure. It's therefore a revolution in science that Freud introduces. If this science has the value he claims for it, does it have this value? Does it have this meaning? I want to pause here to try to restore the point of view currently effaced from which Freud's work can be viewed in its proper light. I shall ask you straight away to be prepared for a contrast between what Freud's work authentically signifies and what is currently being offered as the sense of psychoanalysis. For many of you, the students, as you draw nearer to things in the mental sphere, psychoanalysis is, it's said, first of all, a means to a better understanding of the mentally ill. I can't recommend too highly that those of you who have the opportunity to become acquainted with the analytic literature, and God knows how enormous, almost diffuse it has become, combine this reading with an at least equivalent measure of Freud himself. The difference will leap out at you. The term frustration, for example, has become the leitmotif of the prolific mothers of analytic literature in English, with the abandonism of and relationship of dependence it comprises. Now, this term is quite simply absent from Freud's work. The simplistic use of notions taken out of context, like that of reality testing, or of bastardizing notions like that of object relation, the recourse to the ineffability of affective contact and of lived experience, all of this is strictly foreign to the inspiration behind Freud's work. So that was a lot right there. But pretty much what was being said in the first half is pretty much what I already iterated at. And it's Freud, not only should he be taken on the criterion in which his work is based off of, but also that in his relationship to modern science, he does something radically new and changes, the value of sense, good sense in science, in the scientific method, and how we should establish our orientation around a method which could be called science. And this not only puts science into question, but it also puts whether or not psychoanalysis can be a science. This is something that has troubled Freud and is something that Lacan is willing to take on. But then in this other section, we get something really interesting. I think it's really crucial to understand the bastardization of certain terms in Freud that become not only bastardized, but also just distort psychoanalysis itself because other forms of analytic inquiry mouthwash them. And one of them, is reality testing. Reality testing in, let's say, ego psychology, and many other forms of analysis that use a more imaginarized form of the transference that want to focus on the affective dimension, the ego's orientation, really do this technique to see if the person's really in reality or if they're kind of delusional or psychotic or disassociating. For example, what time is it? How are you feeling today? What is your name? What year is it? All these different things as if the analyst knows what reality is. They already pre-established a certain notion and criteria of how the analysand ought to act. And this is not what Freud was doing. Freud was analyzing. He was not prescribing. He was not trying to situate the patient in his reality. And so reality testing for Freud was something very technical. The reality testing is something that the psyche does when it is trying to achieve the pleasure principle. This is something that he talks about as early in the Project of Scientific Psychology. And then I think we get this a bit in the essay on Verneinung, or the two poles of mental functioning, two principles of mental functioning. Sorry, not two poles. But this idea that the reality testing is pretty much the way in which something can be deemed pleasurable or unpleasurable. And again, this is something that is based upon sort of way in which the child's primitive model of the psyche is designated as something that exists and something that is introjected and projected as far as you know, the good object, bad object, but not in the object relationship sense. I'll get to that later. What is happening is that there's something that is being affirmed and denied in this process that has to do with the sense of the psyche's aim for homeostasis, right? This is what aligns with what Freud would call the pleasure ego, and what the pleasure ego is something that's situated around uh what is going to feed the child's demand for satisfaction, or as we will call it, the demand for love on the child to the mother. But what this introjection and projection is not, in terms of this pleasure ego and of the object that is deemed either pleasurable or unpleasurable, it is not in the way in which object relations would deem as introjection is projection of a good and bad object. Mommy's breast and the splitting of the object as good and bad is going to affect the ego, because again, we're not dealing with the ego, we're dealing with the unconscious. And what this reality testing for Freud is related to is this primordial affirmation of something that would constitute the psyche. It's a sort of negative structure. And again, you could read this in his negation paper or Die Verneinung, that what is being attributed is an existence, a judgment of existence, that there is an object that exists, and then there's a judgment of its attribution of being pleasurable or unpleasurable. And this has a libidinal orientation to it, a libidinal structure. And this leads me to the other point that Lacan makes of the bastardization of this notion of object relation, because object relations is a field that comes from Melanie Klein and then is carried on in the Anglo world with people like Winnicott, people like Fairburn, and many others like Guntrip. Um, and they, again, they don't focus on the ego in the ego psychology sense like Anna Freud by making the ego stronger, but they think that that if we focus on this ego object relation, that is where the underlying issue is. That whatever the ego deems as a bad object, it splits itself and pushes it onto the analyst, or pushes it onto the other, or projects it onto the other. What it doesn't want, it splits it and it spits it out onto the analyst. That is not what Freud was getting at with the object relations. First of all, what the object is a libido object. It is a sexual object, which will become sublimated. Now, I must slow down and correct myself a bit, because the way I'm describing sublimation is, in a sense, not really what Freud would describe as sublimation. I actually just described the way that Lacan would describe sublimation later on. A little bit of a tangent, but I'll still carry on. For Freud, there is the sexual needs, the sort of primitive drives, and then there is the more sublimated aspect in which there is a substitute for that need and that drive, that something can take the place of that primary demand, or that primary drives demand for satisfaction. But for Lacan, the fact is that there is no object without sexuality. And even the fact that sublimation exists, it makes aim of the drives and sexual drives very dubious, that there's a relationship between sexual drives and satisfaction with sublimation, and the fact that sublimation is an aim of the drive, that sexuality is a sublimation. Many will argue that sublimation is desexualizing, but it seems like for Lacan, especially in Seminar 11 and Seminar 16, Freudian slip, I said sexteen, that sublimation has a sexual component. This is where he says in Seminar 11, It is the moment that I'm not fucking that I'm talking to you. And at the same time, I could get the same enjoyment talking to you as if I would be fucking. So the question is, am I fucking right now? And so analysis and understanding the symptom and the compulsion to repeat Freud, which aligns with the beyond the pleasure principle, the death drive, that there becomes a sublimatory aspect to the drive that gets the same satisfaction that it would with this compulsion to repeat, but in the clinic by free associating, by the analyst coming in and talking about the history, their singular truth, right? That was a long-winded tangent, but I think it was still necessary because what I'm trying to elaborate in this um, in this exegesis is that what Freud calls an object relation is radically different and diametrically opposed to the object relations of Klein, Winnicott, Guntrip, and Fairbairn. The Anglo analytic community totally, totally diverges from the Freudian experience. Not only me saying that, but also for Lacan himself, who was very well read in Melanie Klein, and possibly Winnicott, definitely Fairbairn. But with that being said, there's really a lot that we have to rework in reading Freud because a lot of it is just obfuscated by the use and abuse of these terms like libido, like the reality testing, like even the object relations and many other things, and especially the jettisoning of his original original topography of the psychic apparatus because they believe, oh, the only apparatus we need to work on, as we'll talk about in this one, as mentioned in here, is the the only one we need to work on is what Freud gives us in the 1920s, and that's the ego, id, and superego. That's the psychological apparatus right there. But no, yes, these are definitely part of the schemata, but they don't exist without, according to Lacan, they don't exist without the original topography, which is conscious, preconscious, and unconscious. And if we read these early texts that have also autobiographical accounts of Freud, but very much theoretical gems for understanding psychoanalysis, we will see that when we look at, again, consciousness, preconscious, and unconscious, we see how terms like ego, superego, and id situate themselves in relation to this original topography. Okay. So let's conclude, right? Because pretty much this page, these entire next few pages are just going to be ad nauseum the same thing, just with different examples of the text. But the point being is that the greatness of Freud comes in the fact that in his scientific discover or in his scientific endeavor of being a scientist, of being a neurologist, he discovers something radically different. And that is, this notion of the unconscious, the fact that, observing people like Anna O with the studies of hysteria with Joseph Breuer, with experimenting with hypnosis, that something resists even that there's something that resists this ability to heal from certain memory disturbances. And it's what is called the pathogenic nucleus, right? That is the ego. The ego is a pathogenic nucleus. And that's because there is a part of the ego. And again, let me evoke that original topography. The ego is not consciousness. There is an aspect of the ego that relates to consciousness, right? With perception and cognitive abilities and the way that I could say my own name and identify with that on the level of conscious speech. But then there's something on the level of the unconscious that resists, right? There is a resistance of the unconscious, because for Freud, the ego doesn't want to compromise itself by encountering the id, and we could see how the superego censors that and continues to generate these demands or these renunciations. Lacan will call them injunctions to enjoy, but the renunciation, thou shalt not, categorical imperative, operates for the ego and siphons off from the libido or siphons off from the id. The id is this sort of unsignified part of the unconscious, but the unconscious is structured like language. So anything of the id manifests itself on this sort of unconscious full speech, right? And it has no meaning. It's just pure signifier, as I mentioned in the beginning with the notion of the signifier. The symptom is the signifier. So this is how that functions. But to what I was saying, the hypnosis technique for Freud was falling short because we are dealing with something that is resistant. This pathogenic nucleus is resisting the what is happening at the level of the unconscious, and it's something that could only really be understood through the dream analysis and the way that the unconscious formulates itself, this formation of the unconscious to create a wish fulfillment, but then also on the level of free association, which is where analysis does its work, sees the unconscious manifest itself. This right here, with not only the discovery of the unconscious, but how that relates to sexuality, is the crucial aspect of psychoanalysis and what Freud was dealing with. And this not only, again, is something that is a radical achievement for Freud, but also something that changes the sense of modern science. Maybe we could say it changes both the ideals of science and what would be an ideal science. And I'll leave it at that. I hope you learned something. Again, this is part of a different installment where we do short exegeticals on certain aspects of the seminar. I hope that it was fruitful and you learned something. And keep tuning in, keep watching, keep asking questions, keep reading, and always engage with the text. Thank you, everybody. This is your host. This is your friend, Big Signorelli, calling out.
Today, I'll present to you from Seminar 3, the chapter 20, titled The Appeal, the Allusion. And this chapter is very interesting because in the beginning, it seemed to me to be a chapter that just repeats things that we already know, maybe adds some interesting examples, but through rereading it, it led to lots of questions for me that pertain to the chapters that we have already worked through, mainly questions concerning the paternal signifier and how it relates to sexuation. But before we get to these questions, let's start where Lacan starts, which is with this wonderful quote from Freud. If we reflect that the means of representation in dreams are principally visual images and not words, we shall see that it is even more appropriate to compare dreams with a system of writing than with a language. In fact, the interpretation of dreams is completely analogous to the decipherment of an ancient pictographic script, such as Egyptian hieroglyphs. In both cases, there are certain elements which are not intended to be interpreted, but are only designated to serve as determinatives, that is, to establish the meaning of some other element. So this quote, of course, is really interesting from the beginning because we see here that Lacan's focus on the signifier in relation to the unconscious isn't taken from nowhere. It is already there in Freud explicitly. But, and that's what Lacan points out, in a way that Freud didn't even know what he was talking about. Lacan points to the fact that this logic of hieroglyphs that Freud points to here is the logic of the signifier. But what exactly is he talking about here? Lacan draws on an example that isn't explicitly named in the text, but I think what he's referring to is what is called independent pronouns in this hieroglyphic language. Pronouns, for example, like in Latin, aren't always part of the sentence, but sometimes in a written way, in an explicit way. Sometimes they're just implied by the verb that is used, for example. But independent pronouns are a case in which these pronouns are heavily emphasized and aren't just involved in a context. So here, this is the first personal pronoun we see here. On the one hand, it consists of two hieroglyphs, this bowl and this basket with a handle, which refer to a certain phonetic value, in combination with another symbol, in this case, this seated man. And as Lacan says, this phonetic value is the one that gets its meaning through the determinative. This man that doesn't refer to a phonetic value exactly. Because this man can also be, for example, a woman or even a god, lots of other things that basically make clear that the I that is spoken here, the I that is referred to, expressed by this bowl and this basket, is a god saying I, right? So on the right hand we have the determinative, on the left hand we have the phonetic value. If this is the logic of the signifier represented here, of course we know that this god only has meaning, is capable to give this phonetic value its meaning I, the god, is based on the fact that it relates to lots of other signifiers that are not at this place. Like, for example, the man. Right? This god only can give meaning, because it has meaning, through the absence of other possible signs at its place. But even the man that is at this place only refers back to something else, isn't at that place, only refers back to something else, like the woman. So the god isn't the man isn't the woman isn't all the other possible signs that you could make a part of this chain of referral. And that's what is very important for Lacan. There is a meaning that insists in the reference, but no individual unit means anything in itself. It only refers to lots of things that it isn't. And I think that's what we find in his definition of the signifier. The signifier is a sign which refers to another sign, which is as such structured to signify the absence of another sign. So a signifier doesn't signify anything but the absence of another sign, which represents the absence of another sign, which represents the absence of another sign, and so on and so on. Regarding this example of the hieroglyphs, it's pretty clear that it is structured in this way. One sign refers to another sign for its meaning, in some sense that implicit, refers to another sign to receive its meaning from the other sign. But the other sign as such is, as the first one, just structured in the sense that it represents the absence of another sign it has to refer to. So I would say, regarding also the last two chapters we discussed of metaphor and metonymy 1 and 2, this chain of referral is the order of contiguity, right? Of linguistic taxonomies that are structured of signifiers referring to each other. That's what we have learned in the chapter Metaphor and Metonymy 1, that the order of metonymy is that of articulation and of contiguity, as such, just structured in the notion of causality. That's really interesting, right? One thing leads to another thing, leads to another thing, leads to another thing, ad infinitum. And I think one could claim, or at least also Nick explicitly pointed me to that, is that the description of the big other, of the symbolic other, as something that is deceptive, this description is legitimized if we equate deceptiveness with referral, right? One thing isn't anything except what it refers to. So everything is in some sense deceptive in this metonymy. One thing isn't what it really is. It is the other thing that it refers to, is the other thing that it refers to. So it's an extreme slippage and slipperiness of the signifier, which gives it the characteristic of being deceptive. That's why the big other other than the little other, is characterized by its ability to be deceptive. Now, if we look at this situation, what is apparent is that no signification can really take place. So, of course, we learn from Lacan that one signifier referring to another is structuring a situation of opposition. One thing is opposed to another thing. But if this other sign as such only refers to the absence of another sign, speaking metaphorically, right, speaking in images, you can say it doesn't have any solidity to be capable of being involved in such a situation of opposition. There's nothing really to contrast against, because what is it? It's just the absence of another sign, of another sign, of another sign. So there's no stable possibility for meaning. The signification of the entire chain of this contiguity we have now described is in essence -1. There is no stable signification if there's only a fleeting one. Right? The God it has its meaning because it isn't the man, because it isn't the woman. There's some kind of signification that insists, but it's fleeting. And if we summarize it, it's in its entirety, the entire metonymic chain just signifies absence, just signifies -1. And then we see this very interesting thing that Lacan points out in the chapter I've Just Been to the Butcher's, and also in other places in the seminar, where he's saying, when I told you that in the other there must be a sector of entirely real objects, it was understood that this introduction of reality is always a function of speech, always a function of speech. For it to be possible to relate anything at all in the relation to the subject and the other to a foundation in the real, somewhere there must be something non-deceptive. So, in this quote, he is claiming that as a part of the function of speech in the big other, even though it has the capability of being deceptive, there must be something that is non-deceptive. And this non-deceptive element also supports the sense of reality, which, as we know, is very, very important for schizophrenia, right? For psychosis. Reality gets lost, right? But the crucial thing I wanted to point out about this quote is a non-deceptive element is necessary. So we have this chain of signification, of contiguity that only has a fleeting signification that in the end you can summarize as -1, because it is in essence deceptive, as I said, sliding. But in this chain, there has to emerge from the big other a special kind of signifier, a unique kind of signifier that is non-deceptive, that is not sliding at all. And here, as you can see, I put this signifier, the special non-deceptive signifier, above the bar, because it is, in my opinion, legitimate to claim already at this point in Lacan's work in Seminar 3 that this signifier is involved in a metaphor. At the moment, in my argumentation or in this presentation, why is it a metaphor? Because, first of all, it breaks the rules of metonymy. It breaks the rules of metonymy, and that's what we have learned as a characteristic of metaphor. A characteristic of metaphor is that it undoes lexical connection, that it breaks the chain of reference. That's one of the characteristics Lacan pointed out. Why does it break the rules of this chain? Well, the rule of this chain is -1. The law of this chain is -1, i.e. the necessity to refer to another signifier. But this special kind of signifier doesn't need to refer to another signifier. So it is breaking the rules of this chain. In essence, it only refers to -1 because that's what the chain amounts to. But it is referring to a -1 in a way that isn't deceptive, that doesn't need to refer to another signifier to substantialize this -1 into a concrete signifier. And now it gets even more interesting. Even though it's essentially a signifier, it of course isn't a signifier without meaning. I stress this fact that it doesn't depend on meaning, but is the source of meaning. So first of all, that's kind of repeating what I already said. It doesn't depend on another meaning, i.e. it doesn't depend on the reference to another signifier. But the first part of this quote is even more interesting because it's a strange translation. In the original, it says "Ce n'est pas un signifiant sans signification." So that means that doesn't mean it isn't a signifier without meaning, but it means it isn't a signifier without signification. So it actually is, in some sense, a signifier without meaning, but it is a signifier that isn't without meaning making. Signification, right? And that's why the second sentence makes the second sentence even more clear. It doesn't need to refer to another signifier to give it meaning, but it is the source of meaning. It's the source of signification. So if we look back at our metonymical situation, in which the first sign gets its fleeting meaning from the second sign, the second sign that is as such structured to refer to to signify the absence of another sign. In this situation, this special kind of signifier enters. In the same way that the sheaf replaces Boaz, substitutes for Boaz, this special kind of signifier substitutes in for the signifier that at that point was structured as to signify the absence of another signifier, and thus makes the second signifier capable of giving the first one a stable meaning. Why is it capable of giving it a stable meaning? Well, because as we learned, our special kind of signifier doesn't need to refer to another signifier. I'm unsure of this. As I said, there are lots of questions in this presentation. Maybe it could be represented more like this. So you have a first signifier referring to a second signifier, which as such would be structured to signify -1. And then that one refers back to our special signifier. This special signifier gives the second one a very stable signification because it itself doesn't need to refer to anything anymore because that's its special property. And thus the second one can also give the first one a stable signification because it relies on our special signifier. What does this special signifier thus do? I think I already referenced to this. In my opinion, maybe one could claim that its special property is that it turns the -1 into something that before was truly fleeting, always at the edge of the chain, as something that can now be a kind of presence that is substantialized. So the absence is now involved as an element in the chain that can be used in its operation, right? Absence becomes presence through this special kind of signifier. And that's why then the oppositional couple truly works. Whereas before, it's not an oppositional couple, it's more that this opposing element to the presence of the first signifier is continuously displaced through the chain, continuously fleeting. Now this element of the -1 of this absence can stay at a certain place, can remain at a certain place, and thus make the first signifier give it its substance as something that is present because it can be opposed to this now stably present absence. It is an absence because, as I said, its ultimate signification is just -1. But -1 as something that can stay at a place that isn't a runaway effect. So thus, this special signifier makes absence a presence, and makes a question an answer. It isn't truly the answer to what is the ultimate signification. It's more that this question can now function as a kind of answer. And thus, the utilization of deception is actually now introduced into the life of the subject. That's what Lacan is saying in this quote. The dialectical correlate of the basic structure, which makes of the speech of subject to subject, speech that may deceive, is that there is also something that does not deceive. So basically what he's saying here is the special kind of signifier, which represents the entirety of the chain as -1, is a non-deceptive element because it isn't fleeting, and only through that it actually enables deception. So faith in this special kind of signifier enables feint. And that's what the psychotic doesn't have. That's what he makes in this quote clear. Now we have looked at the neurotic structure of discourse, but if we now refer what we have learned to the psychotic, we learn the psychotic doesn't have a stable sense of reality. Reality is something that starts to decline in the beginning of Schreber's psychosis. And that's why, because the subject, the neurotic one, can speak to the other insofar as with him it's a question of faith or feint. But for the psychotic, this permanent exercise of deception, which tends to subvert any order whatever, whether mythical or not, in thought itself, unfolds as a passive phenomenon, as an experience lived through by the subject in an imaginary dimension that is suffered, which is a fundamental characteristic of the imaginary. Lots of things going on in this quote, but I think the important thing is that because the psychotic doesn't have this element of non-deceptiveness, his entire world is deceptiveness. Everything is deception, right? And that's why reality also isn't stable. We will look at that in a moment. Reality isn't stable because he doesn't have this non-deceptive element. Everything is deception. And that's why he has basically certainty that everything is uncertain. And that means he doesn't have access to the utilization of deception in his discourse. That this special signifier isn't involved or isn't accepted by the psychotic is related to the Oedipus complex. That's what we learn here, because it is this Oedipal complex where this special kind of signifier is introduced. And here Lacan calls this signifier the law. This fundamental law is simply a law of symbolization. This is what the Oedipus complex means. This is a very interesting quote, because what does it mean that this special kind of signifier can be called the law of symbolization? Well, on the one hand, I would claim it's the law of symbolization because it is basically the entire chain as such. It's overarching summary and logic, which is -1, represented as such, right? And that's, of course, the order of contiguity is represented by this special kind of signifier. But on the other hand, I think it can also be rightly called the law of symbolization, because this special kind of signifier reads or enables to read -1 as a +1, as a presence. And thus you have these two aspects united in this special kind of signifier. Metaphor and metonymy together are what this special kind of signifier is. But I think the most important part, of course, is that in essence it is the -1. The -1 that is the overarching law of metonymy, of the symbolic chain we were talking about. And also the interesting part here, I think, is when the special kind of signifier intervenes in this chain, what is happening? It's the law of signification, the law of this chain, so a kind of meta element intervening into this chain itself to stabilize it. What is lacking in psychosis is this primordial signifier, of course, and Lacan calls it here the primordial male signifier. And that gets even more clear if we look a few chapters before. He calls it the signifier father. This signifier is lacking. The paternal function is lacking for the psychotic, and the paternal function is exactly our special signifier. It is the father. The two sides, male and female, of sexuality are not given data, are nothing that could be deduced from experience. How could the individual situate himself within sexuality if he didn't already possess the system of signifiers insofar as it institutes the place that enables him to see at a distance as an enigmatic object, the thing that is the most difficult of access, namely his own death. So there's lots of interesting stuff in this quote, but what bothers me mainly is how exactly is male and female introduced into the life of the subject through this primordial signifier, because that's what the seminar continuously refers to. Male and female is introduced, the sexual difference is introduced through this special kind of signifier, through the paternal function. That's a question, but let's first look at the rest of this quote. So I think what is interesting is that, first of all, death and sexuality become accessible, become something that is approachable by the subject through the special kind of signifier. And as we know, as Lacan put it before in the hysterics question, woman, death, birth, reproduction, all of these things are things that are not symbolized, are not accessible by the signifier. Basically, the signifier is kind of incapable of accounting for these things because of various reasons that Lacan investigated in the hysterics question. But just as deceptiveness becomes enabled by this non-deceptive element, I think what changes is this question that continuously was insisting in the chain, this -1, now becomes accessible to the subject, because it's not something that continuously is like running away from him, that is continuously insisting in the chain but always at its edge, but it is symbolized by an element, by the special kind of signifier, and thus maybe doesn't get answered, but the question as such is accessible, just as the deceptiveness is accessible through this non-deceptive element. But let us get to my question. So the interesting thing is that Lacan is saying here is that there is nothing in our everyday experience, that thus in the real or in the imaginary, that would justify sexual difference. Basically, male and female bodies on a biological level, there is nothing that would justify the introduction of sexual difference. But something happens that makes the female position be characterized by an absence. And he says there's a symbolic lack of material, right? How can that happen? And there the answer is the phallic gestalt, right? Lots of other interesting things here. The woman's access to the Oedipal complex, her imaginary identification is accomplished via the father, exactly as in the boy's case, by virtue of the prevalence of the imaginary form of the phallus, but insofar as this form is itself taken as the symbolic element central to the Oedipus complex. So both of them, male and female, have to identify with this special kind of signifier, with the paternal function we have been speaking about. But this happens by something on the body, because he was talking about the Gestalt, he was talking about the imaginary level. So an imaginary element of the body becoming symbolic. In the just biological sense, or in the everyday experience sense, in the physical sense, there is no sexual difference. But sexual difference only enters the body basically by a part of the body becoming a symbol. And as we know from psychoanalysis, this of course is the phallus, right? This part of the body that becomes a symbolic element, being opposed to an absence. Now my question is, isn't this referring one thing to another thing? A presence to an absence? Isn't that the order of contiguity? How exactly is our special kind of paternal function involved here? Is it making this presence a presence because it's now capable of being opposed to an absence, and the absence is something that is a kind of presence? Is it that? How exactly is it that? Very unclear. And maybe these questions are just not answered in seminar 3. I couldn't find an answer. But I think what is important is that whereas identification before was an identification on the imaginary level, now the imaginary has been invaded in some sense. The imaginary body has been invaded by the symbolic. And now there's a symbolic identification with the paternal function in two different ways. In a way that's somehow involved with a presence and somehow involved with an absence. What exactly that means, how sexual difference is involved there, unclear. Is it maybe that woman identifies with the paternal function in the sense that a paternal function ultimately represents nothing but a -1, an absence, whereas the masculine side identifies with the paternal function insofar as the paternal function enables a specific signification, i.e. a certain presence? I don't know, just my speculations. What is clear nonetheless is that the hysteric identifies with this paternal function in the sense that it is a question about sexuation, in the sense that the paternal function represents a -1, a question as something that is accessible, and even a question as something that is object of a symbolic identification for the hysteric. This is opposed to neurosis, in which I think he is gesturing towards in this chapter the fact that in neurosis, the identification with the paternal function is the identification with the paternal function in the sense that it is something that is an answer, something that gives signified a meaning. Basically, you could again put it in this chain where the law of the chain itself intervenes in the metonymic chain, and of course it creates a meaning. And I think maybe, this is my assumption, neurosis is the identification with the paternal function in the sense that it is signified, whereas for hysteria it's a signifier with representing a question. For example, with Dora, it's the father's cough that represents the question, what is a woman, or the other's desire, the father's desire, as something that now is accessible through the symbolic element of the father's cough, even though it isn't answered. And it is this question that she's trying to approach, what is a woman, through her identification with the father or the man. Because in this situation, for Dora, of course, it's very similar like for the butcher's wife. She's identifying with her car as the butcher's wife, the witty butcher's wife, from the interpretation of dreams, identifies with the desire of her husband, i.e. the thin woman. And what Lacan points out is that for hysteria there's a certain question, and he names this question either or. And sometimes I think often the question is said to be, what is a woman? That's of course also in this seminar, but also, am I a woman or am I a man? Right? Why is this question prevalent for the hysteric? Because she identifies with a male counterpart to access this question of what is a woman. That's also what Lacan is pointing out in this whole chapter, that there's a dissymmetry of identification, a detour of identification. This is beautifully exemplified by these quotes from Freud. For instance, he says, what a hysteric expresses by vomiting, an obsessional will express by painstaking protective measures against infection, while a paraphrenic will be led to complaints or suspicions that he is being poisoned. These are all of them different representations of the patient's wish to become pregnant, which have been repressed into the unconscious, or of his defensive reactions against the wish. In this example, I think it's pretty clear what the hysteric's position characterizes. So we know that pregnancy, birth, reproduction is what are the names of this leg, right? In the symbolic chain. And what does the hysteric do? She represents a question. Her body is marked by this paternal function in the sense that it represents a question that is now accessible. She becomes a question. She identifies with a question by being symptomatic, vomiting, right? And thus being a question for the doctors around her. Why is she vomiting? What's the meaning of the symptom? On the other hand, the obsessional has an answer. He's identifying with the paternal function in the sense that it is an answer, in the sense that it is a signified. He basically symbolized pregnancy by calling it infection. Right? Pregnancy is infection, and this answer to a question, this signified, for him becomes an obsessional thought that all his actions revolve around. What is a thought? Well, it has to be a signified. And all this is, of course, different for the psychotic, who has the feeling that he's being poisoned from agents from without. So the hysteric has the either or, whereas the neurotic, and I'm not sure about my schema here at all, as I said before, maybe the neurotic is characterized by neither nor, because, as Lacan also says in this chapter, he obfuscates the question. He avoids the question. By doing what? Well, by saying, neither am I the paternal function as such, as something that doesn't have to refer to something else, nor am I the -1 of the female position, but somehow he is both by them interacting to produce a signified. But the signified, in some sense, is hiding the fact that behind it is the paternal function which represents the question. And now let us come to the question of the psychotic. Because we have said this paternal function introduces human reality into the life of the subject. Human reality through the successful Oedipus complex. Why exactly does it introduce reality, and how does it do? How is it connected? How is this paternal function connected with the Oedipus complex? To answer that question, we have to look at our trusty schema L. In the beginning, we have the child-mother relationship, and I would claim that this mother is, in some sense, also a symbolic mother, because she speaks, because she's sometimes present and sometimes absent. So it's the mother-other. And this discourse of the mother-other, of the absent and present mother, is representing nothing but a -1 in the sense that it is fleeting. So it's somehow a question. It's not a question that's by now approachable in the sense that it will be after the paternal function was operative, but it is a -1. And then we have the father intervening in this imaginary dyad as something that gives a meaning to the -1 of the mother other. Exactly, he's giving this special kind of signifier, which I would claim could be this S that we find in the schema L. It's this S that the father provides, that the child identifies with, that is the effective response to the -1 of the big other. So what the father is providing the child is a way to respond to the mother other. The bone that can be used to keep the jaws of the crocodile mother open, as he says in a different seminar way later. And what do we have here? For example, we have the father's cough as such a response to the big other. But we also have the signifier or the phonemic element of rat for the red man to respond to the question of the other. Thus, we have our schema L here. And the important fact is, of course, this symbolic axis, which does, as Lacan doesn't get tired to say in this seminar, create a distance in the realm of the imaginary, separating the ego from the little other. It creates an inside and an outside. It divides inside from outside through, of course, the function of this paternal signifier. So there is a symbolic outside, differentiated from this special signifier that is, of course, beyond the simple metonymic chain. And then we also have an imaginary outside. But the important fact is this symbolic identification for the child creates a difference between inside and outside. And this is what makes reality exist, because now there's a division between my thoughts and the outside world. That's what he also means when he says the following: if the neurotic inhabits language, the psychotic is inhabited, possessed by language. How can one fail to see in the phenomenology of psychosis that everything from the beginning to the end stems from a particular relationship between the subject and this language that has suddenly been thrust into the foreground, that speaks all by itself, out loud, as well as in its neutrality. So this part will be interesting in a moment. But before we get to it, it's clear that the neurotic lives inside this inside that has been established by the symbolic identification, this inside that is linguistic. Because he has this distance-creating symbolic axis. So this axis, the symbolic axis, is necessary to divide inside from outside. What happens when this doesn't exist is we can see in an example that Lacan gives, the example of analysis. So first of all, the speech that is passed between the ego and the little other, Lacan calls allusion. He also characterizes in this chapter as the yes, yes, yes you say to the person next to you, to the little other next to you. But in analysis, what is crucial is something else. It's the speech that is passed between the S and the O, which, referencing to the title of this seminar, I would call the appeal. It is the question that is asked by the big other about his desire to the subject, and the subject needs to have this special kind of signifier provided to him in the Oedipus complex to respond to this appeal. And what happens in analysis? Of course, the analyst takes the position of the big other as the one who asks a question, right? Who represents this -1. That's why Lacan says that many analysts have made the experience that patients come to them and they leave analysis being psychotics. But what happens for the psychotic is he can't respond, but suddenly the presence of the big other is very, very pertinent, is very enters his consciousness much stronger than anywhere else. So in analysis, he has to encounter the big other, and that the inability to respond to it can kickstart a full psychotic crisis. So as we see here, the psychotic just doesn't have the imaginary axes, just doesn't have the symbolic axes to respond to the big other. He only has this imaginary axis. What happens? Hallucination happens. Verbal hallucination occurs. Visual hallucination occurs. Why? Because the big other enters the realm of the imaginary, of our everyday sensual, and thus we have verbal hallucination. The discourse of the big other in the imaginary register, without this bone that keeps the jaws of the mother crocodile separated, amounts to possession. There is no distance established between the little other and the ego of the subject, and the big other. Language itself becomes a little other. That's why Lacan says the psychotic is possessed by language. And this verbal hallucination that is passed is of course made up of this unconscious discourse of the psychotic, like for example signifiers like luder, as we have learned. And then Lacan points out another way in which this L schema doesn't function properly for the psychotic. The structure doesn't function properly, by referring to another psychoanalyst, or maybe Lacan would even polemically call her ego psychologist, Helene Deutsch, who wrote a paper on what she calls the as-if, als ob, personality, who are people she encountered in her clinic that didn't have any object cathexis, that only had libido investment in themselves, and all that they did was basically imitating other people around themselves. They didn't have any inner life, that's what she says, any true personal interests. They were only imitating people around themselves. And that's what Lacan's saying about psychoses. Psychotics, they never enter the game of signifiers except through a kind of external imitation. So we have learned that neurotics relate to the signifier as neither nor. Hysterics relate to it as either or. And that's them also relating to sexual difference, of course. What does a psychotic have? It doesn't have man and woman. It doesn't have either or, neither nor, because he doesn't have this symbolic axis. He only has as if. He can pretend to be a man. He can act as if he would be a man. And that's what Lacan points out. What he somewhere calls his manly honor cries out aloud when he happens suddenly to be aroused a bit too strongly by the enigma of the absolute other. So he pretends kind of to be a man, but he isn't a man on a symbolic level. Symbolically, somewhat truly, what is expressed by this symbolic in its verbal hallucination as it appears in the imaginary is that he's the wife of God. And then Lacan makes another analogy to explain more detailed how this schema L doesn't function properly in psychosis. And this another detour he embarks on begins with a very, very interesting sentence, which is the following. There's a good reason for this, which is that this other lies entirely within itself, Freud says, but at the same time entirely outside itself. What could that refer to? I think it refers to the fact the big other, in a sense, is only instituted as it should be, as it functions normally, by something that is outside itself. mainly our paternal function. And the paternal function is in its entirety the big other because it represents the law of the big other, the -1. On the other hand, the big other is entirely within itself because this special signifier intervenes into the chain. So the entirety of the chain itself intervenes into the chain as a metaphoric substitution. And there's also the fact that this paternal function, at least at this point, is called a signifier. But we have learned now that the big other is what is called ecstatic, the ecstatic relation to the other. That's what Lacan calls this entirely without, entirely within, which maybe I could claim that maybe it's not wrong to say that this is what later on becomes extimacy. Ecstasy is what Lacan relates to two theories of medieval love. In the Middle Ages, a distinction was drawn between what was called the physical theory and the ecstatic theory of love. And I think it's not wrong to characterize the physical theory of love as being located on the imaginary plane, on the relation of ego and little other. Because what's the aim of physical love? What's the aim of the imaginary relation? Well, it is an aim of complete unity. Whereas I think what he's referring here to of this theory of love in the Middle Ages is probably courtly love. What is the goal of this courtly love? It's definitely not complete physical unity with the object of love, but rather it's characterized by a mixture of sensuality and chastity. In courtly love, you never really interact with the lady, you never really have physical intimacy with the lady, but rather the whole love relation is based on something being inaccessible, a symbolic object. Now, these abstract rituals of love is sometimes still practiced today, Lacan says, back then, but it more and more appears as a form of madness. Why? This Platonic form of love, the courtly love, isn't practiced anymore. But if it is practiced, it's practiced in an increasingly external manner. There isn't anymore this acceptance that a true love object is something that is inaccessible. Rather, the physical form of love prevails. And that means that just as the symbolic discourse isn't something that's internalized by the psychotic subject and that thus appears from outside, appearing as a kind of madness, also practicing Platonic love in our age, or at least in Lacan's day, appears as a kind of madness because it also appears as something that isn't integrated anymore. But let's return to the psychotic discourse, to this hallucination of God speaking to him, of the unconscious speaking to him from the outside. Lacan refers to a very famous French psychiatrist called Clérambault by saying that Clérambault claimed that this discourse that comes from the outside to the psychotic, the unconscious discourse as verbal hallucination, is something that is structured. And Lacan very much agrees with this, but he has a criticism. The criticism is the following. Clérambault is absolutely right to insist upon this being that it is structured. The conclusion he draws is that we are dealing with simple mechanical phenomena. This is totally inadequate. It's much more promising to think of it in terms of the internal structure of language. I think this quote is very, very interesting because even though he's talking about Clérambault, this quote I think can adequately be used to draw a distinction between the cliché understanding of psychoanalysis to Lacan's theory of psychoanalysis. Because what is mechanics? I think if we look at the typical model of Freud's theory, it's usually viewed as something mechanical. And what is usually claimed about psychoanalysis is that these interact like physical forces, where it's all dependent on the amounts of libidinal energy that is invested. So the psyche is a kind of steam engine. And that's, of course, what mechanics is. Mechanics concerns itself with the relationship between force, matter, and motion among physical objects. But this is different to Lacan. How Lacan views the psyche is as being constituted by a formal structure, the structure of the signifier. The signifier as something that refers to another sign, which as such is structured to refer to the absence of another sign. With a formal structure, the amount of energy you invest into a signifier isn't so important. It's like a chess game. It isn't important how heavy the piece, an individual piece is. That doesn't change anything about the laws they have to follow. But in the quote before, the important thing is Lacan claimed that the entire structure of language appears as an hallucinatory phenomenon in psychoses from the outside. So let's look at Schreber's verbal hallucination. What does he encounter? Well, he encounters two kinds of speech. On the one hand, you have the fundamental language, the world of revelation, which opens up a new dimension and gives a feeling of ineffable understanding which corresponds to nothing previously experienced. And on the other hand, you have the learned by rote, the language of the birds. The signified is empty. That's the important thing. The voices that use this speech, they don't even know what they are saying. The signifier is retained for its purely formal properties, which are used, for example, to form series. So everything they do is metonymy. And thus we really have the formal conditions of language appearing in this outer discourse, in this verbal hallucination, because what we have here is, of course, the paternal signifier, these special signifiers that don't need to refer to anything else to have a meaning, but that are characterized by a feeling of ineffable understanding. Like, for example, Luda. I think that's a very important signifier, right? And then you have the learn by rote, which is nothing but contiguity, metonymy. And the most interesting thing, and that's what I want to end my presentation with, is that while he reconstructs his sense of reality, what happens is that these two types of signifiers are integrated with each other. He's forming a metaphor. The fundamental language and the learned by rote are integrated into each other. That's what Lacan is saying here. At the same time as he reconstructs his world, that which is close to him and which he deals with, the speech of this anterior God with whom he has this unusual relation, which is an image of copulation, as is shown by the first dream of psychotic invasion. This God enters the universe of the learned by rote, of the refrain of empty speech and of objectification.